When people talk about the 100 Years' War, they picture armored knights, massive castles, and the brutal clash of steel. But the weapon that shattered the French army wasn't forged by a blacksmith, carried by nobles, or even meant to impress. It was a simple battlefield trap, a hidden barrier of sharpened stakes that flipped the balance of power and crippled France's most elite forces. This quiet, overlooked weapon didn't just stop cavalry. It rewired medieval warfare and exposed the fatal weaknesses of Europe's strongest military tradition. Number 1. The hidden weapon beneath the mud. During the major clashes of the 100 Years' War, the French believed their armored cavalry represented the ultimate form of medieval power. Generations of nobles had been trained to see themselves as the unstoppable hammer of European warfare. Their armor grew heavier, their war horses stronger, and their military culture more confident. From their perspective, no formation of foot soldiers could hold back a full-speed knightly charge. Yet the weapon that repeatedly broke the French army wasn't made of steel, didn't shine under the sun, and wasn't carried in a knight's hands. It was a row of sharpened wooden stakes hammered into the soil at calculated angles. An innovation so simple that French commanders dismissed it entirely, right up until the moment it destroyed their formations. These stakes weren't scattered randomly. English and Welsh soldiers created deliberate lines of angled wooden spears, long enough to pierce a horse's chest and strong enough to stop even the heaviest mount. The placement felt almost invisible from a distance. Knights approaching at speed couldn't tell where the trap began until it was too late. Many chroniclers wrote about horses suddenly collapsing, as if struck by unseen force, because the barrier blended with mud, trampled grass, and churned battlefield ground. The stakes didn't kill the French army by themselves. What they did was far more devastating. They neutralized the single most important weapon France relied on: momentum. A knight needed a powerful gallop to deliver force with his lance. When that momentum vanished, so did his advantage. Horses stumbled, reared back, or fell directly onto their riders. Knights who survived the initial impact often found themselves pinned, disoriented, or separated from their supporting lines. And once cavalry lost formation, the English archers tore them apart. The French counted on chivalric shock tactics. They ran headfirst into the simplest but most effective countermeasure of the entire medieval period. What looked like harmless wood turned into the hidden blade that repeatedly tore through France's proudest armies. The power of these buried stakes lay in their combination with English strategy. They weren't just obstacles, they were part of a battlefield ecosystem. Mud, slope, rain, and arrow storms all worked with the stakes, turning England's defensive line into a machine designed to break cavalry from the inside out. At Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, the French encountered this invisible wall and paid for their arrogance with thousands of casualties. These battles became brutal reminders that war in the Middle Ages wasn't only won by those with the brightest armor or the heaviest horses. Sometimes victory belonged to the side that understood how to use the ground itself as a secret weapon. Number 2. How the stake barrier actually worked. The genius of the stake barrier wasn't in the material. Almost any army could sharpen wood, but in its engineering and the discipline behind its deployment. Each English archer carried several stakes, roughly 3 to 5 feet long, carved with a hardened point and sometimes charred to strengthen the wood. These stakes were personal equipment, meaning archers trained with them, practiced installing them quickly, and knew exactly how deep and at what angle they should be set. That alone separated the English system from anything the French used. The stakes were driven into the ground at a forward angle somewhere between 30 and 45 degrees. This angle mattered more than anything else. A horse striking a vertical pole might glance off or break it. A horse hitting an angled pole doesn't escape. It rides down the stake, pushing it deeper while driving the sharpened end through its own body. Even an armored warhorse couldn't overcome that kind of mechanical force, and knights depended entirely on their mounts for mobility. A fallen horse meant a trapped rider. The English rarely placed the stakes in a straight fence-like line. Instead, they built layered zones that created unpredictable channels. In some battles, they used staggered rows so that even if the first line broke, the second and third still caught the charge. These patterns funneled cavalry into narrow killing lanes, where English longbowmen concentrated their volleys. That's why contemporary reports describe the battlefield as a forest of obstacles, where horses had no safe path forward. Flexibility was another key element. English archers could pull up their stakes and reposition them quickly if the enemy tried to flank the formation. At Agincourt, for example, Henry the Fayou ordered his archers to advance their stakes several times during the early phases of the battle, shrinking the battlefield and tightening the trap. This mobility shocked the French, who were used to missile troops acting passively. The French cavalry expected infantry to break under pressure. Instead, they found themselves charging into a terrain trap engineered to cancel their advantages. Combined with sticky mud, shield-like rows of archers, and narrow terrain, the stakes didn't just stop a charge. They turned the battlefield into a cage. The French found themselves unable to retreat, unable to maneuver, and unable to generate the momentum needed for their lances. Every mistake amplified the next one. From an engineering perspective, the stakes worked because they exploited the vulnerability of a mounted knight, the dependency on forward movement. The moment that movement stopped, the knight became slower, less balanced, and dramatically easier to kill. That is exactly what the English wanted, and exactly what the stakes delivered. Number 3. Why nobody expected wood to defeat steel. For centuries, European warfare revolved around the idea that cavalry represented the pinnacle of military prestige. Knights trained from childhood to fight on horseback, invested fortunes into armor, and believed that their class alone decided the outcome of battles. This worldview created blind spots that the English exploited mercilessly. Because the French saw themselves as natural victors in any confrontation involving mounted charges, they simply could not imagine that commoners with wooden stakes could undermine their entire military doctrine. Most French nobles considered archers to be insignificant peasants. They underestimated them, not only socially, but tactically. When French scouts observed English positions, they didn't interpret the small angled sticks as a serious obstacle. After all, these were not tall pikes, not fortified walls, not iron caltrops, just wood hammered into earth. Nothing about them seemed powerful enough to challenge a knight in full plate armor. But the stakes weren't designed to impress the eye. They were designed to disrupt the physics of a cavalry charge. Knights didn't think in those terms. Their confidence came from generations of tradition, not engineering. Another reason for French overconfidence was the culture of honor and glory. Knightly warfare emphasized bold, aggressive charges meant to break the enemy through personal valor. This often led French cavalry to attack prematurely or without coordination. It also made them vulnerable to terrain manipulation, something the English used masterfully. English commanders constructed battlefields like puzzles, muddy slopes, narrow funnels, hidden stakes, and pre-measured firing ranges. The French walked into these traps because they thought brute force would overcome anything. There was also a psychological factor. Horses are intelligent animals, but in battle they react to pain, fear, and sudden obstacles. The spikes created panic. Once the first line of horses hesitated or fell, the rear lines pushed into them, worsening the chaos. Medieval armies relied heavily on cohesion. Once that broke, even elite troops became scattered targets. The French also lacked flexible tactics. Their doctrine emphasized direct confrontation rather than strategic patience. So when their leading ranks crashed into stakes, they responded not with withdrawal or regrouping, but with more waves of cavalry. This repeated mistake multiplied casualties. Chroniclers describe knights screaming for help, trapped under their own horses, suffocating in mud, while new riders slammed into the growing pile of bodies. The entire French command system was unprepared for a defense that didn't rely on strength or status, but on geometry and timing. The English didn't need to match French armor or fight in glamorous duels. They simply needed to break the chain of movement that made cavalry effective. The stakes were the perfect tool for that, a tool the French never learned to properly counter because they couldn't accept that such an unglamorous weapon could redefine the rules of war. Number 4. Crécy, where the invisible wall stopped the unstoppable. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 was the first major demonstration of how devastating the stake system could be when combined with disciplined archery and smart positioning. Edward III didn't have the numbers to face France in open field combat. What he did have was time, terrain, and soldiers trained to reshape the battlefield in his favor. As the French army gathered, confident in its overwhelming superiority, the English quietly built their hidden wall of angled stakes across the front of their position. The slope they chose wasn't steep, but it was enough to reduce the speed of a charge. The stakes finished the job. When the French launched their attack, the Genoese crossbowmen led the advance. They were exhausted from a long march and disadvantaged by wet strings from sudden rainfall. As they approached the English line, volleys of arrows cut into their ranks. They tried to fall back, but the French cavalry behind them pushed forward, assuming the crossbowmen were simply cowardly. What those knights didn't realize was that they were galloping directly into a trap. As the first wave of cavalry reached the English front, the stakes did exactly what they were designed to do. Horses screamed, fell, or swerved uncontrollably. Knights slammed into the broken bodies of animals, losing their footing and falling into mud. The carefully choreographed rhythm of a cavalry charge dissolved instantly. The French rear ranks, unable to see the stakes and unaware of what caused the slowdown, continued charging downhill, piling into the chaos ahead. This wasn't a momentary disruption. It was total collapse. Once the French line stalled, English archers switched to heavier arrows aimed at vulnerable joints and unprotected areas. English men-at-arms advanced cautiously, finishing off dismounted knights who were too weighed down by armor to stand. Chroniclers described the scene as a field of iron men drowning in their own power. A brutal inversion of French expectations. Crécy's outcome shocked Europe. The French had every traditional advantage: superior numbers, elite cavalry, higher-ranking commanders. Yet they lost thousands of nobles in a single afternoon. What destroyed them wasn't magic, nor superior metalwork, nor even superior archery alone. It was the disruption of their primary weapon, the cavalry charge, by a system of wooden stakes that transformed the battlefield into a death trap. Crécy proved a harsh lesson. The era of unquestioned knightly dominance was over. The battlefield had become a place where engineering, discipline, and terrain could humiliate even the most powerful army. And the French would face the same invisible wall again at Poitiers and Agincourt, learning each time that the deadliest weapon in English hands was the one buried beneath the mud. Number 5, Poitiers and Agincourt, when the trap tightened again. At Poitiers in 1356, the French commanders arrived determined to erase the humiliation of Crécy. They approached with renewed confidence, larger numbers, and a belief that this time they had learned enough to overwhelm the English. But while they adjusted their strategy, the English perfected theirs. Once again, archers planted stake lines across the front, anchoring them into the earth and shaping the battlefield long before the French charge began. Poitiers was cluttered with hedges, narrow paths, and uneven terrain, allowing the English to use natural obstacles in combination with the stakes to funnel the French into tight channels. Cavalry, which relied on open space, found itself choked into narrow lanes, unable to pick up speed or maneuver around the wooden barriers jutting out of the mud. As night slowed, English archers poured arrows into the compressed formations, forcing riders to drop their lances and raise shields. When a horse hesitated or stumbled at the sight of stakes, the riders behind collided into them, and the chain reaction rippled through the line. The cavalry charge, once the pride of French warfare, became a tangled mass of men and horses unable to advance or retreat. The English infantry, lightly armored and flexible, could step forward at the perfect moment to counterattack, while the French were still struggling to orient themselves. Agincourt in 1415 turned this tactical mismatch into a defining moment of the medieval age. The terrain naturally created a narrow killing ground between two dense forests, and the relentless rain converted the soil into deep, sucking mud. Henry V understood immediately how to weaponize these conditions. He ordered his archers to drive their stakes at forward angles, creating a defensive fence across the entire front line. When the French advanced, they did so slowly and with great effort. Their armor, much heavier than at Crécy or Poitiers, weighed them down. Horses tried to find footing in the churned soil, but slipped, fell, or halted the moment they saw the stakes. And a cavalry charge requires momentum. Once it breaks, there is no recovery. French knights who fell into the stakes were crushed by the ranks behind them, or trapped by their armor so deeply in the mud that they could not rise. When their infantry moved forward to fill the gap, the congestion only worsened. Thousands of soldiers found themselves packed shoulder to shoulder, unable to swing weapons or lift shields. English archers, after emptying quivers, simply stepped forward with mallets, knives, and hatchets. The stakes had done their work long before melee combat began. They created a broken advance, exhausted men, and a battlefield tilted entirely toward the defensive side. Agincourt became a symbol of how something so simple could cripple even the most prestigious medieval armies. Number 6. Why the French couldn't counter the stake system. It is easy to imagine that after facing these obstacles repeatedly, France would eventually develop a counter. But medieval warfare wasn't just about tactics. It was shaped by class, culture, and deeply rooted military traditions. The biggest barrier to countering the stakes was psychological. French nobles viewed cavalry as the rightful spearhead of battle. The idea that a charge should be delayed, rerouted, or replaced by infantry coordination was seen as dishonorable and contrary to chivalric values. Knights believed they were meant to lead from the front, and they approached English positions with that mindset regardless of what intelligence reports suggested. Even when French scouts saw the stakes, commanders often assumed their horses could force a breakthrough, or that archers wouldn't hold under pressure. But the stakes were never meant to stop cavalry by strength alone. They worked by interrupting momentum. A jump over them was risky, a slow approach was suicidal under arrow fire, and a full-speed charge was impossible without impalement. Clearing them required lightly armored infantry to advance under a storm of arrows, something few men were willing to attempt. The French also suffered from rigid battlefield organization. Their armies were divided into waves of nobles who expected the right to attack first. By the time they realized the stakes required a different formation, the window to reorganize had passed. Mud, weather, and panic could turn a minute of hesitation into total collapse. Another issue was timing. The English always placed their stakes early and quickly because archers carried their own and trained to deploy them in minutes. French commanders never matched this speed. By the time France formed a counterplan, the English line was already fortified. Even when the French tried using crossbowmen or their own archers to soften the English defense, they were outshot and outranged. Crossbows offered powerful projectiles, but they lacked the sustained rate of fire needed to suppress English lines long enough for engineers to remove stakes. French cavalry doctrine also lacked flexibility. Their war horses were trained to charge in formation, not to navigate obstacle fields or stop and reposition. Once the charge faltered, morale did too. A stalled cavalry unit was not just ineffective, it was vulnerable. The English exploited this vulnerability again and again. The French problem wasn't ignorance, they understood the stakes were dangerous. Their problem was that their entire battlefield identity depended on a style of combat incompatible with counters to the stake system. As long as that culture remained, the stakes remained lethal. Number 7. A weapon that changed medieval warfare. The sharpened stake seems small compared to swords, polearms, or siege engines, yet its influence on medieval warfare was enormous. It forced commanders to rethink the fundamental assumptions of combat. For centuries, armies saw mobility and shock power as the keys to victory. Heavy cavalry symbolized authority, wealth, and military dominance. But the stake barrier reshaped the battlefield into a place where preparation outweighed prestige, and simple engineering trumped noble lineage. Once the English demonstrated that cavalry could be neutralized by terrain manipulation and missile fire, European warfare began to shift toward infantry-centric models. Other regions learned similar lessons. Swiss pike formations, Flemish militias, and later early gunpowder units all emphasized coordinated infantry tactics over individual heroic charges. The concept of shaping the battlefield became essential. stakes represented an early form of portable fortification. They were lightweight, adaptable, and required no special equipment to deploy. In a sense, they were the medieval version of anti-tank obstacles, simple tools that destroyed the most expensive and prestigious units on the field. European commanders began using trenches, pits, barricades, and caltrops, not just to protect positions, but to dictate where and how enemies could move. These changes influenced armor design as well. If cavalry could no longer force decisive breakthroughs, knights needed to adapt to new roles. Armor became heavier, more specialized, and later transitioned to forms suited for dismounted combat. Infantry weapons diversified to exploit immobilized opponents. Even early firearms benefited from the evolving battlefield shaped by wooden stakes. Once armies realized that carefully positioned shooters could determine the fate of cavalry, musketeers later filled the role longbowmen once held. The shift marked the decline of the knight as the dominant force and the rise of organized infantry as the core of European armies. The stakes also changed military psychology. For French nobles, repeated defeats at the hands of simpler weapons created tension within the aristocratic class. Chronicles describe shock, frustration, and disbelief. Many knights refused to accept that a weapon used by commoners could dismantle elite units. But the battlefield does not reward pride. It rewards adaptability. Stakes became a reminder that innovation could come from below, not just from noble halls. This lesson echoed through the Middle Ages and beyond. Number 8. The legacy buried beneath every English victory. While swords, lances, and longbows receive most of the credit in popular culture, battlefield archaeology shows that wooden stakes played a deciding role in key English victories. Excavations at sites associated with the 100 Years' War revealed disturbed soil lines consistent with rows of angled stakes. In some places, the soil still shows compression patterns indicating where horses collided with obstacles. Chroniclers on both sides mention horses screaming, men collapsing under their own comrades, and formations grinding to a halt against what looked like a simple fence. These accounts confirm that the stakes weren't just an accessory. They were central to how English armies operated. The English approach worked because it integrated the stakes into a larger system, rather than treating them as a last-minute defensive measure. Archers knew exactly how far apart to place them. Commanders understood how terrain amplified their effect. Infantry knew when to advance past them, or when to pull them up and shift the line. This coordination turned a basic wooden tool into a battlefield-transforming structure. Its success also depended on discipline. English soldiers were trained to hold formation behind the stakes, resist the urge to chase wounded cavalry, and wait until French momentum fully collapsed. This patience, combined with the stakes' stopping power, created moments where French units had no space to retreat or reorganize. Even the aftermath of battles reveals their significance. Many French knights who survived wrote about the humiliation of being stopped not by steel or valor, but by sharpened logs hidden under mud. To a class raised on chivalric ideals, this was a painful reckoning. But for modern historians, that reaction highlights the stakes' effectiveness. They attacked not only the physical body of the army, but its identity, morale, and cohesion. In the broader picture of medieval warfare, the wooden stake barrier stands as one of the most underrated innovations. It required no blacksmiths, no rare materials, and no elite training, yet it repeatedly fractured some of the most powerful armies in Europe. It proved that the future of war belonged to forces that could adapt quickly, control terrain, and combine simple tools with intelligent planning. When we look back at the English victories during the 100 Years' War, the real secret medieval weapon isn't hidden in an armory or sung about in heroic tales. It was buried in the ground, silent and overlooked, doing its work before the battle even began.